Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Sakari, chairman of the Fan History Project, which is coordinating some of these programs. Today, we're having John D. Berry interview Ted White. Ted, as all of you know, and the reason you're here, has been um, one of our most active fans since for over 70 years. Um, John, we're here to listen to some of his stories and tell about some of the people he's known. John has known and worked with Ted for over 50 years. And I am going to turn it over to them. John, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Well, I've known Ted since I was in high school. He was already a very well-established fan, fine writer, publisher of fanzines, and focal point of, at that point, New York fandom. But I think we begin at the beginning. Ted, how did you get into fandom?
Well, it was the year I was 13, and that was in 1951. I was in 8th grade, so sort of halfway between grade and high school. And that summer, a friend of mine who lived down the street and had heard that I read science fiction told me he had a couple science fiction books that I could have. And when he gave them to me, they weren't books at all. They were issues of astounding science fiction from a year earlier, from summer or so of 1950. And I had been reading science fiction in book form ever since 4th grade, well, 3rd grade, really. John Carroll Cross's The Angry Planet, which is not very good science fiction. In 4th grade, I discovered Heinlein, which is much better. So I was up on science fiction to some extent. I picked up copies of magazines on newsstands and leafed through them, but they struck me when I was younger and mostly a comic book reader as over my head. And so when I got these couple of issues of Astounding handed to me, I kind of looked askance at them, but thought, okay, I'll try them out. And I read them both, cover to cover. I believe there was a Van Vogt serial in one of them, which I found impenetrable. Bear in mind, I was still only 13. But this whole experience of having all these stories right there in this magazine called Astounding made me realize I'd seen that magazine on newsstands. There must be current issues out there. So I got on my bicycle and I rode to the nearest drugstore. In those days, all the drugstores had decent newsstands. And the first thing I bought was the new Astounding. And I was shocked to discover the price had gone up from 25 to 35 cents since 1950 in the last year. But then I kept on buying others. I was mostly buying digests to begin with because, in my snobbish point of view, pulps were kind of lower class, kind of trashy, and digests weren't. And I could bring digests more safely into my house without my father looking down his nose too badly at them. So eventually, because I was a voracious reader, I read everything in all the digests. The next step was the pulps. And when I got to the pulps, I discovered fandom, mostly in the pages of startling stories and thrilling wonder stories, which both had fanzine review columns. Well, at least one of the two did. They were companion magazines. And they both had these letter columns that were like almost miniature fanzines. The people in the letter columns were talking to each other, responding to each other's letters in previous issues, talking in this argot, which had these interesting phrases scattered through them, like fanzine and prosing. And it dawned on me that people were doing this and that this was something I could tap into. Now, at 13, I felt very bottom rung of the ladder. I didn't feel I had any standing in fandom. Nobody knew who I was. I didn't know who most of them were. And I would be starting at the very beginning. I was the quintessential Neo fan. And one of the non-pulp SF magazines being published then, which I really enjoyed, was Ray Palmer's Otherworld. It was a digest. I didn't hit it in my first round of buying digest because it wasn't distributed to Falls Church. I had to range 3 and 5 miles away to find it on sale. But when I did, not only was this chatty editorial and long editorial responses to the letters in the letter column, but there was this little classified ad section in the back that was purely for fans, and you could place your little ads for free. And some people advertised fanzines in it. But the ad that caught my eye was from a guy who lived in the suburbs of Chicago named Warren Freeberg. Warren was advertising for copies of Superman #1. Now, this was only 13 or so years after it was published, so it wasn't that ancient at that point. But I was a huge comic book fan and a serious collector who delved into the basements and attics of everyone I knew looking for old comic books stowed away in musty boxes. And so I wrote a letter to Warren saying, I'm sure you'll get more than one response to your ad. Would you please pass on the surplus to me? Because I'd like to get one too. Well, this was incredibly naive of me. In actual fact, Warren never got any responses to his ad. But he and I started corresponding. And Warren put out a fanzine, so he sent me a copy. It's called Brevazine. It was a little 4x6-inch digest size fanzine put out on a postcard mimeo. And it was the first fanzine I ever saw. And I was enormously intrigued with it. I showed it to all my local friends. And I immediately sent him off artwork for it, naively assuming that somehow he'd take these full-page drawings of mine and shrink them down to digest size somehow without effort. In actual fact, he actually did do that with some of them, but he had to do it with this laborious process where you lay out a grid of squares over the artwork.
Oh, yeah.
Reproduce it square by square. Didn't look too much like my original drawing except the basic outline, but oh well, it wasn't that good anyway. But I started writing also for it, and it was in the pages of Brevazine that I had my first feud, which was with Terry Carr. And what had happened was I had done a little article for Brevazine about science fiction and comic books. But because I had no distribution for EC comics, I'd never seen EC's SF comics, and I was talking about Strange Adventures and Mystery in Space from DC and a couple of Avon comics. And that was about it. And Terry wrote this rebuttal in which he basically said, you missed all the good stuff, which was the ECs. And he was right, but I didn't know it because I'd never seen them. But that's how I first had contact with Terry Carr, with whom I had a long and interesting fan and professional career thereafter. But that's how I got into fandom. It was through Warren Freeberg and his fanzine Brevazine and my contributions to it. Terry was also a contributor. Warren said he was the next Ray Bradbury. Warren mostly published fiction in his little fanzine. Bad amateur essay. I wrote some too.
Well, this segues perfectly into my next question. How did you start publishing fanzines?
Well, why or when?
When? How? When?
Okay. Well, I didn't put out my first fanzine until 1953, so a couple of years later. But I did quasi-fan publications in 52, but they were for the Nascent Comics fandom, not for SF fandom. And they're now extremely rare and valuable and collectible and go for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a copy. I wish I could find my extras. But what happened was much taken with Brevazine and knowing it was done on a postcard Mimeo and being inherently interested in the Mimeo process. When I was in 8th grade, we were setting up a new high school because our town had just turned into a city and set up its new school system. I would become a freshman the following year, in the first year of our new high school. But we were at that point designing publications, picking team mascots, things like that. And we did have a little newspaper, which was produced by Mimeo. And I had done a cartoon for it, and I was asked to stencil it. I had no idea how you cut a stencil. Neither did they. The end result was pretty horrible. I mean, barely legible, really. No writing plate or drawing plate, behind the stencil. No real light box. I just traced it as best I could using available light. It was, but it intrigued me with the Mimeo process. I've got to learn how to do this and do it right. So the summer of 1952, I bought a postcard Mimeo for around 10 or 15 bucks from Sears Roebuck with cans of, I think, mostly blue and red ink. I don't know whether I got any black. But my first publications were essentially to try out stenciling and try out the Mimeo. So I did this little 4-page thing called The Facts Behind Superman, something like that, in which it was mostly artwork showing the, for instance, evolution of the S symbol on Superman's chest, dumb things like that. But all cut on stencil and run off. And then that fall was the presidential election, Stevenson versus Eisenhower. And for my school, we were having mock elections, and I did a little single pager called The Republicrat, which was basically news and gossip about the forthcoming election, which I passed out in school. So those were my first fan publications. And I did not regard them as fanzines because I knew fanzines were better than them. I knew because by then I was getting other people's fanzines and I could see what was going on in the world of fanzines. I was getting Joel Nidall's Vega, which I got from the first issue. And that came out every month and improved very rapidly. I even had the cover on the 3rd or 4th issue, but it was, after that, it was above my touch. And in Vega, there was a column by Marion Zimmer Bradley called something like What Every Neo Fan Should Know, something like that. It was advice to newcomers to fandom column. And it was very useful, very helpful, very practical. And she talked about what went into publishing the first issue of your fanzine. And I could see that this was going to be an ambitious undertaking, and not one that I was going to approach casually. It was something I was going to have to think about, work on, all of which were means of putting it off. And in the summer of 1953, one of my local chores was mowing lawns for both my parents and my grandparents who lived next door. And combined lawns are quite large. It could take the better part of the day to mow them. Although I did talk my parents into getting a power mower at one point, they got an electric one. So it had a very long cord and a huge spool on the top, and unspooled as you moved away from the outlet. But as you walked around a square, you had to do a figure eight on the fourth corner to keep from running over the wire. And of course, any bushes in the middle were a problem. And so I didn't speed things up too much. So I had lots and lots of time to think while I was mowing the lawn. And I used to think about this fanzine I was going to do. I thought about two things when I was lawn mowing. I thought about the fan things I wanted to do and the pro things I wanted to do. The pro things were much more nebulous in the future, but I wanted my own prozine. And I designed cover logos in my head, and I wrote editorials in my head that were kind of Ray Pomeranz. But I also thought about fanzines a lot and tried to plan out fanzines. All of this came to naught. In August of 1953, on a hot summer day, no air conditioning, windows wide open, I decided, the hell with it. Let's just do it. Let's just pub my ish, as the saying used to go. And so what would I do for material? Well, I'd written a half dozen rather mediocre, very short SF stories, some of which I had gotten A grades in English class on. I had done a bunch of drawings and cartoons. They weren't enough to fill up a fanzine, but they were a start. So then I had dealings with a man on Staten Island named Dick Witter of F&SF Books, from whom I bought lots of old pulp magazines, but also at one point a kind of a potluck of, I don't know, maybe a foot or a foot and a half of fanzines, all of them from the 40s. And most of them were pretty mediocre, N3F publications, stuff like that. A few were decent, some are Spear's earliest fanzines. But scattered amongst them, though, were fanzines with stories in them by people I'd never heard of because they were no longer active in fandom. And so I blithely reprinted a whole bunch of that stuff. Never asked for permissions. I was too naive and I had no idea how I would get in touch with the authors. I mean, I was pretty sure their current addresses wouldn't be the ones they had in 1942. So I put together the first issue of a 4x6-inch fanzine, which I called Zip, the fanzine that moves right along, because it was small, it was pocket size. And I wrote my parts of it on stencil and on an Elite typewriter, because I get more words on a page that way. And I put it out in an edition of 35 or 40 copies. I assembled a mailing list from the letter columns of fanzines like Vega. But I did send a copy to Bob Tucker, but I was afraid to send it to Red Boggs, because Red he intimidated me. I was afraid of him. I was afraid he'd shit on my fanzine, which in fact he did do later. When I worked up my nerves somewhere around the third or fourth or fifth issue, I sent him copies, and he sent me a little letter saying, I won't be trading you Skyhook for this. So, you know, it wasn't a good fanzine. What can I say? Hello?
Well, that's sort of my next question, actually, again, sort of logically comes from that. How did you start thinking about the design of fanzines, something you've given a lot of thought to in practice and in theory in later years, obviously not when you were 13?
Well, even at 13, I regarded myself as an artist. I mean, throughout my childhood, I trained as an artist. I mean, I had art teachers. I learned how to paint. I learned how to do pastels. I learned how to do a lot of stuff, some of which I forgot and had to reteach myself, like how to do oils. Never got into acrylics. But throughout my teen years, I did lots and lots of artwork. Some of it appeared in fanzines. Later on, I was the art editor for my friend John Hitchcock's fanzine, Umbra, and I did covers for Umbra, at least one of which was photo offset. And I did, I wanted to be a posing illustrator. And when I started going to conventions in 1955, you could buy very decent interior artwork at the auctions for $5 and $10 a copy. And I picked up some really nice stuff, Paul Calais among others. And I studied all that. I looked at how they did it. And there was this art store in Washington, D.C. called Muse. And I discovered when I went in there once that they had all kinds of neat supplies. They had scratchboard pens. They had craft tint. They had the craft tint solvents, two different ones. And they had Zipatone, the overlays. And I bought a bunch of all that stuff and brought it home and worked with it. When I was a senior in high school, I took an art class in which it turned out my art teacher didn't know anything about any of the commercial techniques. I ended up teaching him. He was a pure fine artist, in quotes. And he was one of the people who called me Mars Boy. Had contempt for science fiction per se. But most of my high school teachers shared that opinion. But at any rate, I always thought I was an artist, and I was very interested in the design aspects that related to art, like the Bauhaus school, which I discovered when I was maybe 14 or 15. At the same time, I was discovering 12-tone music and a lot of other interesting experimental stuff that occurred in the early and the 20th century. It all hung together in my mind. It wasn't completely separate. And when I was doing cult scenes in the 50s, I used Bauhaus techniques, big bars of shading above type, stuff like that. And I also made a discovery in that same general period of time. When I was studying art, I was also going to the art museums in DC and actually studying the real art itself. I discovered Mondrian. And Mondrian was an incredible eye-opener for me. The man was a genius, flat out. Without Mondrian, we would not have 20th century graphic magazine design at all. It would still be neo-Victorian and worse. Cluttered pages with incongruous type. Mondrian showed us how to organize space in interesting ways, not in rigid, static ways. And I took everything I learned from that and applied it to fanzines that I was putting out. Not in a self-conscious way, just because I thought it looked better that way. So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah, and then you went on. You over the years you wrote many times about design in fanzines. I published one of those in the '60s, which I must admit had the worst layout I ever did. I'm sorry about that.
I'm glad I don't remember it.
Good.
Yeah, well, at a certain point, you see, I'm a very anal, analytical personality. I'm always thinking about things, figuring them out. And at a certain point, I did that with fanzines. Now, in the 50s, and I was at the height of my Bauhaus and Mondrian period, you might say. Stellar reflected that. Stellar was pretty pretentious in some of its layouts, although I think it was always effective. I don't think there were many failures. But it was, formal, you might say, or formalistic. And then in the end of the 50s, I'd always admired fannishness, but I got into it more as a producer of. I started to learn how to write humorous Spanish stuff. This was before I linked up with Terry Carr, but by then we were kind of friendly rivals. And at the same time, I was starting to put out more fannish and less pretentious fanzines. So I analyzed what I thought made a good, less pretentious fanzine. Quandary was one of my models, not the only one, but definitely a major one. And from this, I took away the notion of hand lettering titles instead of using lettering guides. We're talking Vimeo here exclusively. But doing loose, sprawling hand lettering that still looked good. Cartoon style hand lettering perhaps. There are varieties of ways. Roxy style, et cetera, et cetera. And that made a huge difference. When I took over Void and I look at those first issues that I did of Void, they're still relatively formalistic. I mean, I even used electro stencils in some of them. Whereas later on, they were less formalistic, as I better understood my goals and what I was aiming for. Another thing was the color of the paper. I determined that warm colors of paper were intrinsically more fannish than cool colors. So, yellows and oranges over greens and blues. We're talking mostly twill tone, that kind of colored mimeoc paper. So, at different times, I did put these thoughts into articles. I think over the years I did 2 or 3 of them. At least one popped up in a best of the year anthology in association with a core flick. And I wasn't happy to see it there because I thought it was one of the weaker pieces I'd written that year. And I didn't really want it to represent me. It was sort of a service piece, not something that I could wave in the air proudly.
So when did you start and how did you start reviewing fanzines? Which was also one of your strong points when I first encountered you.
Well, probably it was in Stellar. In Stellar was originally a fanzine devoted to fan fiction in our original definition of it, but it covered a broad area of fan writing, from satire and parody to serious short stories. Larry Stark and Miriam Bradley both wrote really good, serious short stories set in the context of fandom. Charles Burby wrote an apocalyptic post-World War II, post-atomic war fan story. There were many different kinds of fan stories available. And I originally did it as a vehicle for my friend Larry Stark, who was writing all this great fan fiction and was kind of throwing it away in cult scenes and the like. So, and then I just started looking around for other stuff. And some people wrote new stuff for it, and some of it was reprint. But, I didn't want it just to be fiction. So, like a prozine, really, I had features. I had the letter column, the editorial, but I also had fanzine reviews because why not? Keep a little bit in touch with the rest of what's going on in fandom. I always thought that fanzine reviews should be fanzines talking to and about other fanzines. That was always the way I saw it, although I didn't verbalize it immediately. Well, at a certain point, Richard H. Ely, may his name rest in shame, joined the staff of Stellar, mostly originally to type stencils. At that time, I had a lot of typewriters. I had worked for a stationery store and I had a really good discount, employee discount, and I bought typewriters. And I had spare typewriters, big upright manual typewriters, not little portables. And Dick needed a typewriter. All I think he had was a portable at that point. And he lived nearby in Alexandria. And I thought we were friends. He had come back from Korea or Japan, really. He never really made it to Korea. Um, at a point in the mid 50s, probably 56, maybe, I don't know, rejoined Wistra and we all hung out together. So he became part of Stellar and he started doing fanzine reviews for Stellar under the name of Franklin Ford. And at a certain point, I started writing reviews too, just adding them into the column. But at that point, I changed the byline to Franklin Hudson Ford. I had been a huge fan of the Hudson cars in those days. In fact, I was probably driving one at the time. At any rate, Dick took umbrage. It's only one of many things about me he took umbrage with. Ultimately, he consigned me to the innermost reaches of hell and had nothing good to say about me on any context whatsoever. But that was him and his problem. But at that point, he felt I'd stolen Franklin Ford from him. So he was upset about that. So he stopped doing the reviews. So I just started doing all of it. And I think the first one I did that was in any sense memorable was a review of Yandro, in which I kind of laid it out on the line. Yandro was a kind of a mediocre but regular fanzine in those days, which I think it mostly stayed throughout most of its career. But it was what you might call a controversial review as opposed to some people's reviews.
Mhm.
And also, it was not a one paragraph review. It was essentially a little essay review, which is how I think you have to do it. Now, there's two ways you can do such reviews. One is just to run down the list of contents of the fanzine and say something about each item in it. You know, such as Red Boggs had a really good article, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of thing. The other way is to actually look at the fanzine as a whole, draw conclusions from it as a whole, and base your essay on that. Now, I've done both, and I've probably made up too. But, you know, as time went on, I have a fairly critical nature, so I took the approach of being a critic. And later on in Void, I had a column called The Wailing Wall, which was not, for the most part, fanzine reviews. Although I think I may have done some fanzine reviews, but mostly it was prozine reviews, you know, of specific issues of a specific prozine. But all of these things were me preparing without realizing it for a career as a pro. I mean, as far as the fanzine reviews go, I suppose I reached Twin Peaks, in the column I had in Bill Donahoe's Habakkuk in the 90s, contrasted with the columns which are still up on e-fanzines that were syndicated to club zines, about 6
Oh
different
yeah.
around the country. The idea being to introduce club fans to fanzines. Total failure. Did not work at all. I asked every fan ed whose zine I reviewed to let me know what feedback they got, and uniformly they got none.
Hmm.
So much for club fans. You don't want fanzines, you can leave them to them, but you can't force them to read them.
Hmm.
But the column in Habakkuk, oh, I guess that made a permanent enemy of Guy Lewis. But I think it was a really solid column with some really good comments on both fanzines I liked a lot and fanzines I thought were pretty awful. In the category I was ranked Challenger #1.
Yeah, fancy. I mean, what you were doing was criticism. It wasn't just reviews in the sense of, well, as you just described, here's what there is, here's this, this, this.
Yeah, some reviews are just lists of table of contents without even any value judgments.
Yeah, and that has its use, but real criticism was what I found fascinating, and you encouraged me in, and eventually, when you were publishing Amazing and Fantastic, you asked me to do it in the clubhouse.
Yeah,
So it all came around.
full circle.
Yep. But before getting to that, let's go back a little bit. How did you end up moving to New York, which is a large part of your career?
Uh, I think I always knew it was inevitable on some level because as I was growing up in fandom, New York was the epicenter of everything science fictional. You know, it's where all the publishers were. And particularly after Ziff Davis moved to New York, then you didn't even have Amazing and Fantastic Adventures coming out of Chicago anymore. Um, so basically, it was where a lot of things were happening, but not just SF. New York is also where most of the major record companies had their headquarters, and it was where music magazines were published. Now, when I was still doing Gambit, before I started doing Void, which would have been in 1958, I started reviewing jazz records in Gambit. Uh, and with an eye towards writing professional quality reviews of jazz records, but kind of working out the bugs. I even had a column of jazz reviews in the final issue of Boyd Rayburn's ABBA, a fanzine I'd always admired and wanted to be in. So that was a nice kick. When I actually moved to New York City, and I had several separate reasons for doing it, basically it was to begin a career in jazz writing, jazz criticism, and journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the kick that sent me to New York was that I married Sylvia in November of '58, and we moved into this apartment on North Charles Street, which was basically one of a series of row houses in this block, on which we had the top floor, the third floor, and somebody else had second and first floor. It's like one apartment per floor, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the other people who lived in that building were apparently elderly, which is to say, like us now. They took offense at the sounds of us going up and down the stairs after around 7 or 8 o'clock at night. They complained to the landlord about us trumping like a herd of beasts up and down the stairs and keeping them awake all night, which is pretty much nonsense. But I mean, we didn't go in and out. before midnight.
Mhm.
Anyway, the landlord, I don't know whether our lease was up already, it was a half-year lease or something, but he evicted us. But he gave us time to find another place. And at first, we actually did look elsewhere in our neighborhood in Baltimore, which we kind of liked. And we had friends living there. I mean, in the same block we lived in, my friends Fred Ron Bernowitz and I'm blanking on his name now, Richard something or other. Um, he was a Fringe fan, and John and Joanne Magnus. They all lived in one block, the 2800 block of North Charles Street. And at the same time, I thought, there's no point going through all this moving just to move somewhere else where we know we're only going to be for a limited period of time. I know I'm going to end up in New York City. I guess it should be now. So in July and August of 1959, Sylvia and I made a series of trips to New York City, uh, apartment living on each one. And we would stay at the Nunnery, which is this loft that Bill Donahoe and Danny Curran had taken over from a group of women who had given it its name originally. And it was famed in Fannish song and story in the late 50s. It was the site of a small convention called the Fanarcon in the weekend between Christmas and New Year's of 1958. And so anyway, Donahoe said, sure, there's spare sleeping beds and whatnot, and come on up. And we would spend half a week to a week in New York City looking at apartments and not having much luck. I think the nadir was when we looked at this apartment, I should say, on the south side of Houston Street. It was a tall building. I mean, I don't know, tall enough to have elevators. But this apartment was on the ground floor, and it was not in the front of the building. It was on an air shaft. The only windows opened onto this air shaft at the very bottom of the air shaft. And there was still furniture in this place. I should say that the rent on it was probably $40 or $50 a month. It was rent controlled and damn cheap. But it was so dark, so dismal, and there was still furniture in it. And there was a dresser in the bedroom, and I idly pulled the drawer open. In the drawer, I found World War II ration books, which I recognized because I had seen them when I was young. But, it was a sign of how long the last occupants had lived here. Anyway, we didn't take that one. And eventually we did get the place we ended up with, which was on Christopher Street in the Village. That was $68 a month and a fourth floor of 5 walk-up. Thank God we were young. But once there, the first thing I did was start making the rounds of the music magazines. Now, at that time, there were 2 music magazines, Downbeat and Metronome. Downbeat was either a weekly or a bi-weekly, I forget. And when I first started buying it in the early 50s, it was tabloid. It was folded into magazine size, kind of like the early issues of Rolling Stone were. But by the time in the late 50s, it was just a normal magazine size magazine. Metronome was older. It was at least 75 years old. It started as a band magazine, back when bands were all the thing, marching bands, late 19th century stuff. But it evolved into a jazz magazine in the 30s and 40s. It was a monthly. And of the 2 magazines, I liked it much better. I mean, Downbeat was full of news, But Metronome had interesting opinions. And its editor was a guy named Bill Koss, who I found fascinating. He wrote very subjectively and interestingly. And so when I get to New York City, I put together this little portfolio of reviews, reviews of records, reviews of books about jazz, and reviews of the first club dates I'd gone to after being in New York City. And I was going to them a lot because they were all around me. And so I find the first thing I find out is that Downbeat isn't really published out of New York City. Its New York City office is a desk in a room full of different desks where they rent the desk space out individually. But there was a guy named George Hafer there, H-O-E-F. And he was very friendly and very nice, and he took my copies of my portfolio and said they would send them on to Chicago and let me know. Subsequently, the editor in Chicago was a man whose name I now blissfully forget. But for years, he had a column in Stereo Review in which he excoriated rock music, just hated it, irrational hatred. Anyway, he hated me. He hated my material. He rejected it scornfully. So I go over to Bill Koss at Metronome. Bill Koss welcomes me into his office. I sit down and we have a conversation that lasts the better part of an hour. It's fabulous. I give him my portfolio of material. He glances at it, says he'll read it more thoroughly later, and begins to talk to me about things I could do for the magazine. And unfortunately for me, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, my timing was bad because shortly after my initial meeting with Bill, Metronome went into a 6-month hiatus in which they acquired a new publisher and art director. And when they came out with the first new issue the following spring, it was a marvelous improvement. It made a big splash in the jazz field. And I made a big splash in the jazz field because I had a piece about Ornette Coleman in it, who was then the most interesting person in jazz, the most written about, but very controversial. Half the people writing jazz didn't like him, the other half loved him. And I just tried to explain what I thought he was doing. And subsequently, in a published interview, Ornette said that was by far the best piece that had been written about him. It's the only one that got what he was doing. So I felt pretty good about all that. I was going somewhere in jazz once that issue of Metronome came out, and I was well established in it. I was a columnist, a reviewer, all kinds of stuff. I would say I probably had dominated a quarter of the issue. But that was the following spring. I had all that fall and winter yet to deal with. And that was a rough period. Sylvia and I got by on very little money. We actually did sometimes survive on a loaf of what we called used bread, day-old bread, half price, and a shoplifted bar of cream cheese. You know, sometimes that carried us for several days of food. And we scuffled. We both scuffled. I hawked a lot of stuff. She hawked her not her flute, her piccolo. She hawked her piccolo. Sylvia played both flute and piccolo. I hawked my slide rules, all that stuff. And I had little successes. I sold a piece to Playboy that fall, opened my first checking account with the check from Playboy. Uh, Sold lots of other little bits to magazines, page filler bits, that kind of thing. Things you get 10 to 25 bucks a throw for. We just scuffled a lot. Once Metronome was going, I tried to review lots of records for them because they paid $5 a record review, and I could use the money. But they all never used more than 2/3 of the reviews I turned in a given month. They were always extras. So what did I do with the extras? Well, there was this guy in New Jersey who was publishing a sapzine. His name was Lenny. And he asked me if he could run my leftover reviews. And I said, sure. And he put them in his sapzine. Later on, he was a guitar player for Patti Smith. I ran into him backstage at the cellar door in Georgetown, and we hung out. He introduced me to Patti. I said, I really envy you what you've done with your career. And he said, well, I based it on yours, Ted, which I thought was remarkable. But so, you never know what happens with leftover jazz reviews. They can go in any direction.